The next panel is titled A Path Forward on Education Reform. And it will be moderated by Hugh Price, neighbor of mine in Westchester County, New York, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, where his focus is education, equal opportunity, civil rights, and urban affairs. From 1994 until 2003, Mr. Price served as president and chief executive of the National Urban League, the oldest, largest community-based movement empowering blacks to enter the economic and social mainstream. It's also where I first met Mr. Price as a young journalist for the Wall Street Journal. He gave me a nice interview, and I was able to turn it into a nice piece, which I guess he liked because he showed up today. Mr. Price has served as vice president of the Rockefeller Foundation, where he oversaw domestic investments to improve education for at-risk youth, and he is also the author of a number of books on education. Craig Frisby is an associate professor at the College of Education at the University of Missouri. His specializations are curriculum-based assessment. He's also the author of the textbook Meeting the Psychoeducational Needs of Minority Students, Evidence-Based Guidelines for School Psychologists and Other School Personnel. Also joining us, I think, okay. I think, okay, we'll go with who's here. Joining us also on the panel is Kevin Chavous, who is a executive counsel for the American Federation for Children and the Alliance for School Choice. Mr. Chavous is one of the nation's leading education reformers, who I've had the privilege to know and use as a source over the years for my journalism. He is a former member of the Council, the City Council in the District of Columbia, and he too is the author of a number of books related to educational issues. So I will turn things over to Mr. Price, and thank you all.
Thank you, Jason. If you don't mind, I'll stay put. We'll do the panel from here. It's a pleasure to be here, to be back at the National Press Club, and to be back in Washington. It's interesting. I live, as Jason said, in New York. You know, I come to Washington, words like left, right, liberal, conservative sort of pop into the conversation every other word. The virtue of living in New York is we don't speak that language quite as often as we do here. 3 decades ago, or actually just over 3 decades ago, a provocative report was issued entitled "A Nation at Risk." And it was a kind of scathing assessment of the state of public education in this country. And that report triggered an avalanche of reform that engulfs public schools to this day. Reforms were imposed from the top down, the bottom up, and in between. They were imposed consecutively, concurrently, and occasionally at cross purposes. We're familiar with the buzzwords: No Child Left Behind, Common Core, high stakes tests, state takeover and mayoral control, merit pay, school choice and vouchers, charter schools, small schools, schools within schools, race to the top, school turnaround, and on it goes. I tend to look at these policies and where we need to go from here through the prism of what's in the best interests of children who are perpetually left behind. And if you look at it from that angle, we've made some heartening progress in this country in public education. The achievement gaps between white and black students have closed according to the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is basically the nation's report card. High school graduation rates are steadily climbing. We've seen impressive results, particularly in New York City, with small public schools, which have achieved significant academic gains, not so much nationwide, but certainly in New York City. We've seen through the assessments of charter schools that urban charter schools tend to outperform comparable schools in the system and serve young people well, according to a study by an organization called Credo, based at Stanford University. Yet the reality is that far too many young people, and especially black young people, remain left behind. The academic gains for 17-year-olds have stagnated over a lengthy time span, with the exception of 13-year-old Hispanic youngsters who continue to gain in math. The achievement gaps in reading and math that plague Black youngsters have barely budged since the year 2008. As recently as 2013, 50% of Black youngsters in the 4th grade scored below basic in reading, according to the National Assessment of Educational Progress. The Center for Educational Policy projects that it could take 105 years to close the Black-white gap in 4th grade reading in the state of Washington, just by way of example. The achievement gap between poor and rich kids has widened significantly and is now twice the Black-white gap. Minority students, including Black students, continue to be disproportionately disciplined, suspended, and held back in grade. They're still dropping out in droves. According to the Schott Foundation, it's issued an arresting projection that the current pace of progress, it would take nearly 50 years for Black males to secure the same high school graduation rates as their white male peers. The progress in urban education is so sluggish that earlier this year, the Broad Foundation suspended its award to the urban district that makes the greatest progress because they aren't seeing a sufficient amount of progress now. Now, a subject that is seldom discussed in education policy and practice circles is the importance of social and emotional development. It's barely on the radar screen. This is not a fuzzy, feel-good concept. We know from brain research that social and emotional development is essential for learning, achieving, and succeeding. It entails successful management of critical life tasks like learning, forming relationships, control of impulsivity, and so forth. We also know that employers value social and emotional competence enormously. Students who struggle in school often lack the social and emotional skills that are needed to succeed academically. We know, ideally, that parents should attend to the development of their children, that churches and the kinds of mediating organizations that Bob Woodson spoke to should as well. But the question is, what if they don't? Or what if there aren't enough such services to help the children who have needs? When they don't have the social and emotional development they need, they don't pay attention in class, they're not focused on learning, they act out, they interact poorly with their teachers and classmates, they skip class and skip school. We also know from research that low-income and minority children are more likely to exhibit the academic indifference and behavioral difficulties associated with social and emotional deficits. Research from school programs and real-world experience indicate that interventions focused on fortifying youngsters' social and emotional skills help improve their academic performance and their behavior. A recent study by the Teachers College showed that investing in social and emotional development yields measurable benefits that far exceed their costs, and that for every dollar invested, there's a return of $11 economically. Yet educators are under relentless pressure to improve test scores. Teachers and principals are neither trained nor inclined to address youngsters' non-academic needs. This has led me to believe that we need a new paradigm in urban education for the youngsters who are chronically left behind. We need schools that are devoted to the academic and social development of youngsters as a co-equal mission, and that this mission should drive the curriculum, the staffing, the structure, and the means of assessment in these schools. Ironically, social and emotional development is commonplace in parochial schools, private schools, and boarding schools, but not in America's public schools, and especially not in those who serve minority and low-income children who are typically left behind. And that is why I'm of the very strong view that social and emotional development is the next frontier in school reform. Jason, thank you for giving me a few minutes to say my piece, and let me now turn it over to, who wants to go first? You just go to our left? Yeah, okay.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
I'd like to start off with a quote that I have run across that captures the spirit of this education panel, and that quote is from Frederick Douglass, where he states that it's easier to build strong children than it is to fix broken adults. And in that spirit, I'd like to say that as I understand the purpose of this panel, we're here to celebrate some of the positive developments in black education that have occurred since the Moynihan report, but at the same time, we need to honestly discuss some of the challenges and pitfalls in that time period, because there's a lot of areas that need improvement. And the way that I like to think about those areas that need improvement is I like to start it at the state level, then go down to the city level, then come down to the individual school level, and then come down to the level of the student. At the state level, we have a lot of challenges. A lot has occurred in terms of the growth of charter schools. The first charter school state law was passed in 1991 in Minnesota, and since that time, I understand we have a little over 6,000 charter schools in operation today. So there's a lot to celebrate, but at the same time, there is unevenness from state to state with respect to the strength of charter school laws. Some states have charter school laws that don't allow for sufficient autonomy in charter schools. Other states have very strong laws. We have unevenness from state to state in terms of funding for giving minority parents choice as to where they want their children to be educated. And I understand, Mr. Chavous, that there was a recent cause to celebrate in the state of Arizona, where the governor there had provided funding for Native American parents to have greater school choice. So that's certainly something to celebrate. But we still have problems. We have problems with authorizers of charter schools. Many authorizers don't like charter schools. They're not selective in handing out charters, and they won't shut down bad schools. We have unevenness from state to state with respect to alternative certification standards for teachers. There was a time when if you were a very bright graduate of a particular discipline, but you didn't want to go through an education school, you could pursue an alternative certification route that would allow you to teach in some of our nation's more troubled schools. And now there has been some issues with alternative certification systems not being up to the same quality that they were years ago. And of course, we have the problem of hostile teachers' unions who tend to resist charter schools. So that has always been an issue. At the city level, we have issues as well. How many people here are from the city of New York? Anyone here from New York? Okay, sizable number. The mayor that you would have would make a strong difference in terms of being open to charter school development. And from what I hear from people who live in New York, the saying is Bloomberg good, de Blasio bad, with respect to that issue. In cities, many times the success of well-performing charter schools is often a function of whether or not you have well-functioning charter management organizations, whether you have leadership development programs, and of course the KIPP charter schools are at the forefront of having good leadership development programs. Many times we have trouble finding local funders and civic leaders. Now let's go to the school level, and at the school level we begin to get closer to home in terms of some of the frustrations that we have with making progress. Even though we have well-functioning charter schools, there is still an issue of teacher burnout in those schools because we require a lot of charter school teachers. These are teachers that often put in 10, 11, 12-hour days, and there's issues there with still being motivated to continue to put many years in teaching. We've had issues with incompetence in charter school management. Sometimes we have had issues with financial corruption with people who are misusing charter school funds. And then, of course, you always have issues with curriculum and standards that are not carefully thought through, and as a result, charters are closed down. But what I'd like to talk to mostly here is I come from the university system, and I can talk all day about barriers at the state, city, and school level, but there are also barriers that are just as entrenched and formidable in our universities and colleges. This is the site where we train future teachers, school administrators, social workers, school psychologists, and speech and language therapists. And this is where these individuals are socialized to have certain beliefs about how to educate children generally and minority children specifically. I, like many others here, have entered my career interested in one simple question, and that is, how can we best meet the educational needs of minority students in schools? And I've discovered very early on that many times academia is not the place to find answers to those questions. And I've found that I've had to leapfrog over what we talk about in academia, and I'm attracted to this environment here, because it's this environment in which I run across scholars and writers that are candid and tell the truth. The John McWhorters, the Heather McDonalds, the Jason Rileys, these are people that have taken their lumps in various ways because they're honest. And I have appreciated that, and I've learned so much from them. I've discovered that with rare exceptions, and there are exceptions, academia is not necessarily the right place to search for honest answers to these particular questions. And maybe a little bit later on we'll talk about what I find there. I want to also focus on this point, and many times we tend to characterize conflicts between what is best in education for black children as a conflict between the right and the left. Often we'll hear that a lot. And I understand that argument, and there's something to be said for characterizing that argument in that way. However, I tend to take a little bit of a deeper interpretation of where the conflicts truly are. And let me just throw this out here to let you know where I tend to be coming from on this issue. It's not so much a right-left issue, because I've met liberals that get it, and I've also met conservatives that don't get it. The issue for me boils down to an issue of people who tend to live in the world of theory and ideology versus people who tend to have their eyes open to reality. And I know that that sounds a little bit arrogant to some of you, but that's just the way that I've understood this issue. Either you're lost in a world of theory and ideology, or you have your eyes open to reality. And I'll skip over a lot of what we've learned from prior studies, but basically where we are now in terms of what best works for African American communities and kids with respect to education is that we know that there are differences demographically in communities in terms of how that may influence outcomes. And there are some studies that have found that schools play very little difference in that. But there are other studies that also see that even though you might have averages in terms of achievement outcomes that differ by community demographics, you have schools that have basically resulted in higher achievement that defies expectations. And basically, these are the schools that we want to study to find out what they're doing right. Let me just end with this a bit. I've found that when I have really tried to be honest and look at reality and look at what actually helps black children and black education, and I take that knowledge and understanding back to the university, I tend to get three reactions that fall into these categories. There's a segment of academics that get it, and they respond to what is being said, and they know it's true. Even though they're exposed to a lot of other kinds of theories and social justice, this, and white privilege, and all of this business, They know that what we're talking about is true and it is something that is right, and they respond to it. But then I get another segment of folks that are terrified. They're silent. They're afraid. They're afraid to acknowledge these findings because they will say to me, after coming to my office and closing the door, they'll say, Craig, you can say these things, but I can't say these things. I'm afraid to say these things. If I said these things, I would be crucified, but you can say them. So they're silent. And then, of course, you have this segment that is hostile. But it's interesting, when I look at those folks that are hostile to the things that we're talking about on this panel, I notice a particular irony, and that is these are the people that will shout out that they love minority kids and they want to see what works in terms of education and so forth. But when they're shown what actually works, they get mad, because basically they expect reality to conform to their theories instead of letting their theories conform to reality. And as a result, they're hostile to some of the things that we're talking about here. And so let me stop at that point. I have a lot more to say, but let me turn it over to our next
Well, let
speaker.
me just welcome Chancellor Henderson to the panel. Thank you very, very much for joining us. We'll ask Mr. Chavous to speak next and continue to collect your thoughts, and then you'll be third. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Hugh. And I want to initially thank Jason Riley and the Manhattan Institute for putting this panel together. Listening to the previous panel, I was struck by the fact that almost everything we're going to talk about today could apply to the previous panel. I think you're going to deal with some of the challenges in terms of black families, in terms of crime and punishment, in terms of all of these social challenges we face is directly traceable to education. So I'll be brief. I want to talk about where we've been, where we are, and where we need to be. I think Hugh framed it correctly when he started with A Nation at Risk over 30 years ago. And he also was correct in challenging us to view these issues from the vantage point or the prism of a child. And when A Nation at Risk was released over 30 years ago, there were 38 recommendations that were put out before the public. And now, 30 years later, virtually none of them have been adopted. A lot of them had to do with longer school days, longer school years, professionalizing our teaching corps, some common sense things. But over the past 30 years, as we have done some of these things to try to raise standards and at least articulate a concern or desire to deal with some of the various achievement gaps we face, we've done it through the lens of politics. And I think that our biggest challenge in this country, which distinguishes us from most other nations around the world, particularly industrialized nations that are far outpacing us educationally, is everything we do in education is with a political lens. And the second problem we have is nearly everything we talk about in education, and particularly education reform, is with the long-term plan in mind. Common Core talks about standards down the road. School reform plan du jour talks about the 3 to 5 year plan. And I challenge us to, one, take the politics out of education, elevate discussion beyond the politics of the day. There's no Republican or Democratic way to teach a kid how to read, write, count, or compete. I think we also need to make sure that we develop this sense of urgency so that we recognize the need for the long-term plan, but we also acknowledge and commit ourselves to the short-term reality of these kids. I mean, even as we sat here, kids are dropping out of school. Every 26 seconds, nearly 7,000 kids a day. Nearly half the kids of color, particularly in most of our major cities, over half the kids of color, black and brown babies, are dropping out every day. That's over 1 million per year. Since the president's been in office, and he's done a lot to push change, we've had 7 million kids that have dropped out. So it's no wonder why our prison population grows. 82% of our national prison population are high school dropouts. And yes, we're increasing graduation rates, but only 1/3 of our high school graduates are career and college ready. So while we are making advances, I don't want us to accept the dumbed down notion of incrementalism. I don't see anything wrong with having a 90% graduation rate. I don't see anything wrong with us upsetting the apple cart and allow innovation and creativity to flourish even in our school districts. What's wrong with embracing this idea of having these programs we see with some charter schools around the country where the motto and the charge is, give us the kids nobody wants to educate. We want to take care of those kids that are dropping out. You know, I was with some folks in Philly who had an amazing proposal where they were trying to work with the school district for that very thing, but because we're so stuck in the way we've always done it and because of the politics of the day, we refuse to even embrace the innovation and creativity that deals with the most challenged populations that we so-called are dedicated to serve. So I think that we need to elevate the discussion, try to figure out ways to remove politics, make sure we work with innovative local school district leaders like Kaya, who I admire, and I know she's committed to trying to do what she can to push the ball forward. And I'm not just saying that because she's here. I believe that. But we also have to recognize that if we're going to push aside the politics today, we have to be bold and look at things from the prism of these kids. There's absolutely nothing wrong with embracing school choice if it works for kids. And that form of school choice could vary depending on where you live. Now, you know, I think the president has done a really good job pushing forward with charters. But when people say to me, I'm for this, but I'm not for that. I'm for this, but I'm not for that. But I'm for this for my kids, but I'm not for your kids. It just doesn't make sense. There's just indefensible inconsistency in that notion. If you look at our DC Opportunity Scholarship Program, our voucher program, 6,000 kids have gone through that program, 90% graduation rate, and 90% of them are going to college. And they come from schools where 85% of the kids are failing. How is that a bad thing? Yet we allow the politics of the day, and some people say, well, I'm for charters, but I'm not for this. Well, look, charters only take up 6% of our school-age population. Of the 56 million school kids, all this rancor over 6%, and it's a struggle to keep that going. And then our scholarship program, if you say you're for vouchers, and that's even more toxic in terms of some democratic political circles. And at the end of the day, through the prism of kids, we're losing kids. Yeah, I agree that we need to embrace some of the social dynamics that exist in our families, but there's one truism that holds no matter what anyone else tries to tell you differently. That the more people are educated, the less of the bad stuff they deal with. The less they're educated, the more of the bad stuff, whatever that is. Homelessness, crime, joblessness. If we increase our high school graduation rate by 10%, we automatically reduce our murder rate by 20%. And I think that what we need to do is lift up the models that work. Now, you mentioned de Blasio in New York. If he were and I don't get into the personal back and forth, I just deal with it practically. If he were really looking at it from the prism of kids, he would say, you know what, Eva Moskowitz, you know, I don't like you, but I think we can learn from you. So I'm going to sit down and bring some of my best people to see what you're doing with these kids. If there's some there. Because we need to replicate that. We need to elevate the discussion so that we figure out what is the best way we all can benefit from the collective knowledge of those who are serving kids, as opposed to putting everyone in the proverbial box or bucket of, you're over here, so I can't talk to you, or I'm going to fight you, or I'm going to cut you off, or you're for vouchers, so I'm not for you, or you're for charters, or either public schools. You know, the problem is Americans who look at this with a non-toxic lens feel like they're put in a position where they have to pick sides. And the education of our kids should not be about picking sides. It should not be the Republican or Democratic lens or the black, white, brown, yellow lens or the urban-rural lens. And I'm telling you, it has nothing to do with test score preparation. It has to do with a mindset, an energy, a culture. We used to have a learning culture in America. We don't have that now. Other nations have a learning culture where everything they do is wrapped around the proficiency of their kids and tapping into that will to be better and do better. And I think that we need to elevate this discussion about education, and not just education, learning in America. So we build a new learning culture in America, And we built a national obsession around learning. Similar to when Kennedy said in 1961 after Sputnik, we're going to be the first to go on the moon by the end of the decade. And the space program became sacrosanct. It became a national obsession. And there was no political rancor associated with it because it was something that brought us together as Americans. Our challenge in terms of patriotism today is all fear-based. The war on terror. What if we do a pivot? And instead of knocking down things that come from a different vantage point, we accent, emphasize, celebrate those models that work for kids. We build a national esprit de corps around learning and growing our kids. See, I think that's what we need to do. And so I know that there are ways to get there, but the ultimate path to success in terms of growing the proficiency levels of our children is not based on us versus them. It's based on we, all of us. And I think that's what we need to be doing.
Chancellor Henderson, welcome.
Thank you. I apologize for being late. School districts, things happen, and, you know.
No excuses.
So that's part of the problem. So I would say, you know, I come from a very different perspective. I come from the practitioner perspective. I have the honor of serving 48,000 young people here in the nation's capital. As the Chancellor of DC Public Schools, where we've gone from being one of the lowest performing school districts in the country to the fastest improving urban school district in the country. And we have a very long way to go. But I think what gives us hope is that we are seeing steady and consistent improvements, not just academic improvements as measured by test scores, but we're seeing families choose DC public schools. For 40 years, we saw consecutive enrollment decreases. And for the last 3 years, we've seen consecutive enrollment increases. And we are poised to see another increase, which means families see something different happening in DC public schools. When I think about what the real problem is, I think the problem is producing quality education at scale for all children. That's not just my problem as a district, that's the charter's problem as well. There will always be a handful of schools or a handful of teachers or a handful of principals or a handful of districts that are able to make great things happen. The question is how we move from unicorns to a unified system where all children get a high quality education. And what that means is a very different way to approach the problem. When I think about how DCPS has gotten to improve so much, we focused on 3 things. We focused on radically improving the caliber of our educator force. So thinking about how we get and keep the best teachers, get and keep the best school leaders, get and keep the best central office staff. We also recognized that what we were offering our young people in terms of curriculum was not high quality, and it was random because everybody was kind of deciding whatever they wanted to teach to these young people. And so we moved forward with a very rigorous academic curriculum. And then we also know that if school is not a place where kids and parents want to be, then it doesn't matter how good our teachers are or how good our curriculum is, they're not going to come, they're not going to be engaged. And so our theory of action has been around great educators, rigorous curriculum, and engaging students and families. We've also been lucky enough to have a city who aligned with us behind that vision and built supports in place so the district didn't have to do everything. The city recognized that early childhood education was a critical lever to K-12 education being successful, and so invested in universal pre-K. The city also recognized that if I'm busy building buildings, I'm not doing my core teaching and learning, and so they took that off my plate, and other people are modernizing schools, people who are experts in that, so that I get to concentrate on teaching and learning. The city also put up a lot of money because they recognized that if we were going to fix a broken system, they needed to make investments. And, you know, I don't see that happening across the board. More often than not, I see us deciding which sets of kids we're going to educate at very high levels, and then we just kind of leave the rest to pass. I think, we have this schizophrenia about how we do things. On the one hand, we want everybody to be autonomous. It's the rugged individualism of America. I respect your right as a teacher to teach whatever you want, however you want it. I respect your right as a principal to run your school however you want it, wherever you want it. But invariably, that means it's going to work for some people and not for others. It's going to work for some children and some families and not for others. And until we build a system where every child's need is met, then we're going to continue to see these gaps. When I look at other countries that are outperforming us, they don't say teachers do whatever you want to do, schools do whatever you want to do, districts do whatever you want to do. They say here's a national set of standards. And in fact, we are going to, as a country, train our teachers, train our school leaders to implement these standards. There are things that we know are good and right in terms of moving student achievement for kids. And yet and still we make them optional instead of mandatory. When I think about this idea of autonomy and everybody doing what they want, it presupposes that there is a fixed high quality amount of human capital. And that's just not true. The less centralized your system is, the more it depends on the quality of the people. In New Orleans, post-Katrina, lots of people rushed into New Orleans. So New Orleans had a different human capital capacity than it did pre-Katrina. You were able to do some different things. Take the same experiment that happened in New Orleans, where I think people agree that we're seeing progress. It's not all, it's not all cranked up just yet, but we're seeing progress. Apply that same experiment to Detroit, where there has been no infusion of talent, and you have the same people with more autonomy, less regulation, less of an opportunity to push the things that are good and right for children, and we're seeing a completely different result. I think, we know that we have to do a certain set of things in order to be successful. Just like any good teacher, one size doesn't fit all, we have to differentiate. And so we are looking at our students, we're looking at our schools and figuring out how our schools are doing. We're looking at our teachers and figuring out how our teachers are doing. But we actually own every single one of our students. And so when we have conversations and when we look at data, we don't look at it just in the aggregate, we look at individual kids' names, because if my principals and my teachers don't know the children in their buildings and what they need, whether they're instructional needs or their behavioral needs or health service needs, then we're not going to be able to build a system that can appropriately address those needs. We'll continue to rely on the amazing teachers who, are amazing principals who, for whatever reason, are able to knock it out of the park without paying attention to the fact that we actually have the capacity to develop that same behavior, that same talent in people. And the only way that we're going to get to systemic results is, in fact, when we begin to invest in that talent and grow that talent and develop seamless systems where young people don't fall through the cracks. When we know their names, when we can diagnose their problems, and we can get them the appropriate academic or intervention services that they need, we think that policy can do that. And I think policy is very limited. First of all, policy is schizophrenic. 10 years ago, we were focused on one thing. 10 years later, we're focused on the exact opposite. And we allow those policies to dictate everything. In fact, I think it's a combination between policy and practice and that will get us to the right answers. But it really means us committing to the belief that every single one of our kids deserves a high-quality education and building systems to do that. I'll end on the Ava Moskowitz point. People talk about autonomy and how charters have autonomy and they can do whatever they want, however they want. And if you just give people autonomy, then you can produce results like Ava. I find that ironic because Ava does not rely on people doing whatever they want to do. If you've ever been to a Success Academy school, there is a very clear curriculum What you see in one first grade class, you will see in another first grade class. People are trained because what Ava has figured out is these are the right things to do for student achievement. And they're not rocket science. They are things that people have been doing for a really long time. But she's figured out how to systematize that so that whether she has one school or 10 schools or 100 schools, that she can provide that quality consistently. We don't allow districts, we don't allow some folks to make that same calculation and build that same kind of system. But that, in fact, is the only way that we're going to get to where we will get to. The reason why DCPS is improving is not only because we have great people and rigorous academic curriculum and engaged students and parents, but it's also because we knocked down a number of policy barriers that have allowed us to pay our teachers differently, to train our teachers differently, that have allowed us to manage all kinds of things differently. And I think those are the questions that we need to ask. What are our high performers doing, and how do they do it consistently so that we can agree on and begin to implement quality education at scale for every single one, not some, but all of our children.
Thank you. So let me ask any members of the panel whether you have a question for one another. Or did any of the comments provoke?
I just want to
Yeah.
comment on what the Chancellor just said. I think she's absolutely right. There's no question in my mind that if Chancellor Henderson or if a handful of other forward-thinking chancellors around the country had the same freedom that Eva Moskowitz has, they'd have the same results. And I go back to when Hugh started talking about a nation at risk. Those 38 recommendations, virtually none have been adopted. And one of the ones we know is most important is more time on task. You know, that if you're dealing with kids from disaffected communities who are already behind and they have social dynamics or what have you, cognitive issues going on, or they need something that's different from the one-size-fits-all model, then they need more time on task. And that 9-to-3 model we put in place during the Industrial Revolution is outdated. You know, the summer's off is outdated for some. And if Kaya had the freedom to be able to hire folks who follow that, edict that Eva gives out, there's no question it would make a difference. But again, those policies and the politics have been sacrosanct when compared to the needs of children. Yes. And I think that is something we all have to come to grips with, that as long as we allow those arcane and non-kid-friendly rules and regulations to be the centerpiece of the road of operation for most school districts, we will not be able to change things.
Let me tell you how quickly that plays out, right? So we know, of course, that many of our young people need more time. We piloted 8 extended day schools. We worked with the schools to figure out what the best way to do it was for their community, and we gave them the money and the time to do it. We saw, of those 8 schools, 7 of the 8 saw double-digit gains on both math and reading. Wowza, right? In 1 year. And so the second year, I put money in so that 50 of my 112 schools could go to extended day. And we have a provision in our union contract that says that we had to negotiate, because previously we wouldn't have been able to do this, that says that if the teachers vote for a big change in program like extended day, the school can go extended day. Now, if the teachers vote is a problem, but many teachers saw the need for extended day, and so we asked the union to take it to a vote. The union president instructed her building representatives to not hold the vote. Because they don't support extended day. Even though I'm paying, right, don't hold the vote. And so there were a number of schools. We ended up getting 26 schools to go extended day, and of course that year they saw big gains as well. And I have a handful of people who just don't support it. And so I said to my union president as lately as yesterday, because now I have more than 60 schools that want to go extended day. She says, well, I don't know what they're doing in extended day. And I said, who cares what they're doing in extended? Like, why does that matter to you, right? Like, if the teachers and the principal are figuring out how to do this and we're seeing good success, and she said, but it has to be negotiated. And I said, let me ask a question. Who decides what's best for kids? A handful of teachers at a school who do or don't want to work till 6 o'clock, or the people who are literally held responsible by their jobs, like me, the principals, as to whether or not they move student achievement? And she said, well, we're not moving forward with this. And I said, you don't have to have a vote. And we will do it regardless of the vote. And you can take me to the PERB, and you can take me to arbitration and all of that stuff. And by the time that is done, 2 years of kids will have had extended day. And I'm good with that. But there are colleagues of mine who don't have the ability to do what I can do. There are colleagues of mine who don't have the backing of their mayor. There are colleagues of mine whose unions will strike in the streets for lesser things. And so when I have to fight just to get, and I'm putting money, I'm not just saying you need to work a longer day and I'm gonna pay this, putting money, I'm putting training in place, right? I'm allowing teachers and principals to design this. This is what the union says it wants, right? But on principle, you're not going to support it. How can I push student achievement as quickly as I need to when I know what the right levers are to pull, but I can't pull them because of these policy issues?
I have, this exchange reminds me of a speech I gave here at the National Press Club in the late 1990s when I was head of the National Urban League. It was one of those keynote speeches. And I called for the charterization of all public schools. I didn't mean convert them all to charters, but I meant give the people who run the building the autonomy to hire and fire, to extend the day, to allocate and control the budget resources toward the goals that are set by and do that in a grand bargain in exchange for paying teachers as professionals. Tie that to the compensation issue. My friends at the National Education Association said, I bet you wouldn't dare come out and say that to us. I said, I'll come as long as you keep the door to the speaking hall open in the car, gassed up and ready to take me if I have to make a hasty exit. But I think you're reaching to, I mean, these impediments that are just so severe. The other point I'd make, and then I want to turn it over to the audience, in fairness to Mayor de Blasio, he is wrestling with the question of, we've created small public schools which are highly successful, don't get a whole lot of attention. They've been evaluated rigorously. The charter schools exist, but not a lot of attention was paid under the previous administration to the main school, the bulk of the schools. And he and the chancellor are trying to figure out what to do there. And I think their theory is there's sort of finite resources, finite attention, so they're going to turn most of their attention to those schools. And that's a bit of the tension over the expansion of the charters. Anyway, are there any other comments that, yes, colleagues on the panel?
I'd like to make a comment. I agree with all of the comments that have made 100%. I just have a little bit of a different interpretation of what has been said. Again, I agree, I just have a different interpretation. And the interpretation that I come from is that basically years ago, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we would always have large-scale educational research studies that come out with recommendations for how to get kids to learn. And this was in the years way before charter schools. And a lot of times when these studies come out, you always have this political firestorm that surrounds what the study finds. And I always come back to the issue again, and I'll just repeat some things that I said before. We have to understand what is reality and not ideology. And basically, all that we have discovered that works were findings that came out of studies decades ago. And basically, we find that what good public schools do and what good charter schools do, it dovetails 100% with what we find from laboratory research. And let's take this issue of time. And again, I agree with what's been said. I just have a different way to frame it. And the way that I like to frame it is that we have to understand that all children are not the same. You know, one of the pet peeves that I have is that we talk about children, and black children in particular, as this amorphous mass. And no group is an amorphous mass. You have individual differences within all groups. You have super bright kids, you have above average kids, you have average kids, you have slow learners, and then you have special ed kids. And basically, this variability is in all groups of individuals. There's a basic rule of learning that basically says that the time that it takes for the very bright kids to learn something, kids at this level need more time to learn it. I can give a reading passage to someone with a very high IQ, and he'll understand it in a half hour. Someone who's a little bit lower, it takes them more time to read it a number of times to figure out what the passage is saying. They need more time. And so basically, basic laboratory research says if we want to get kids in this range to master the skills that it takes these kids to learn, these kids need more time. It's just a basic fact of life. It's a fact of nature. And so basically what we see is that those charter schools and those public schools that are successful for getting their kids to reach proficiency and to raise their test scores, these are the charter schools that implement the following rules. Now, I'm not recommending this for all schools, but like KIPP schools and Success Academy schools, they have these recommendations in place. Instead of starting at 8:30 and ending at 3:30, many of these schools start at 7:30 and end at 5. In many of these schools, the kids have to come to schools 2 Saturdays a month. In many of these schools, they also have to come 3 weeks during the summer. And you do the calculations, and it's something like 60 to 70% extra time that these kids are spending learning, but they get the results. And so, let me just, one more example, then I'll shut up. Testing. A big political issue in many schools is, why do we have to have a lot of testing? Why do we have to prepare for tests? And the good charter schools and the good public schools, basically, whenever they test their kids, the teachers have a culture in that school where they come together, they look at the test results, they see where the kids are falling down, they meet and talk about how they can teach the material better, and they implement in their curriculum ways to teach so that kids will be successful on tests. But in teachers' unions and many other teacher groups, that's a political football. Many teachers' unions hate testing. They don't want to, they would frame it as we're cutting into our instructional time by teaching to the test. And this is something that our ed schools tell us is something that we don't want to do. And so one of the things, I hate to be overly pessimistic, but like Mr. Chavous said, many things in education are political. And what frustrates many of us is that the research says this is what needs to be done to get kids to learn. And if we can just do it, kids will learn. But almost everything in education tends to be a political football when it comes to time. Discipline is another political football. Testing is another political football.
Okay, let's open it up to any questions from the floor. Yes, right here. Is there a microphone? Yes, right behind you.
Tad Howard. I want to ask you about sports because in my work career, I've noticed 2 characteristics of people who are really good employees. Very basic. They show up every day and they show up on time, and they're team players. They help out. They contribute, stuff like that. Now, one of the disciplines that encourages both of those, show up on time and teamwork, is sports. And sports has a whole bunch of sociological benefits. We could go on forever on that. But I'd just like to know or get some feedback as to where you see the role of sports in education.
Chancellor.
So I actually think that part of offering kids a world-class education means developing their talents, not just their test scores. And so we've actually made millions of dollars of investments in sports, in bands and choruses, in requiring music and art, and foreign language and PE and library, because I do believe we have to develop the whole child. The classroom is not the only place where kids learn how to be good people and good citizens. And I think sports has a very important place. For some of our young people, it's the only reason they come to school. And they will make a particular GPA so that they can play football. And I don't care what your motivation is, as long as we get the results. So I want to make sure that there are schools that have things that engage our young people. I think that, this is a panel, we've been talking fairly generally, but this is a panel about what we need to do for African Americans in education. And I think when you see schools that eliminate programs that are of the arts and music nature or of the sports nature, there's a level of disengagement that happens with our young people particularly. And I think that, that is a problem. When we got to DCPS, we saw schools that were only doing English and math because that's what was being tested. And we had to say, no, every school is going to offer the 4 core subject areas because science and social studies are as important. And every high school will have at least 20 electives, and every middle school will offer algebra, and there will be a band, and there will be courses, and you will go on field trips, and you will go on college trips, and we will rebuild career and technical education, because we have a disconnect in terms of what we think the goal is. We as educators think the goal is higher test scores and beating other countries. My parents don't care about what's happening in Finland. My parents care about whether or not their kid is going to get a job after they finish. And so what I've told my staff is we're not going to, graduation rate is important, but all it tells us is how quickly or slowly people have moved through our dysfunctional system, right? If we're really holding ourselves accountable to the education that we provide being a game changer, then let's hold ourselves accountable to where our kids are 2 years after they graduate from us. Because if 2 years afterwards they're not either in college or in a job, then whatever we've done the whole way around, extend the time, give them great teachers, whatever, it doesn't matter. That's what our stakeholders, that's why Baltimore is burning. Because those young boys don't see a way to a job or the ability to take care of their family. And they don't see that for themselves, they didn't see it for their parents, and they didn't see it for their grandparents. So there's no investment in the city and the infrastructure because there's no investment in them. And what we're trying to do at DCPS is show kids that if you do what we do what we say do over these 12 years and we do it well, we can change your life outcomes.
Next question, yes, right here. And we'll come to the back of the room next, okay?
Yeah, on international PISA testing, you mentioned Finland. We always hear that the U.S. keeps slipping lower and lower in our rankings on math and reading. But when you break it down by race and you look at, say, whites in America compared to whites in Europe, we beat everyone except Finland. And when you look at Asians in America compared to Asians in Asia, we beat everyone except like like Japan and Shanghai, I think. And likewise with Hispanics in America, Hispanics in Mexico, blacks in America, blacks in Africa. So I wonder if the problem isn't, school choice, or maybe we have good schools and good programs, and it's not, I'm reminded of the title of a book, if it's not bad schools, it could just be bad students. And I wonder if all these revolutions we have every year, every 5 years with No Child Left Behind, Common Core, all this, if we're not just spinning our wheels at the institutional level.
Well, I would disagree with that notion. Look, I visit schools all over the country, and we have far too many schools that don't serve kids. Period. And I think that the international comparisons are indicators, but they shouldn't be held sacrosanct. I think that we know that we can do a better job of providing equal access to a high-quality education for all children. I think that has to be the given premise. We also know that when it comes to black and brown babies in America, we're falling short. We also know when it comes to children, white, black, brown, or yellow, who are born in poverty, that the achievement, the fastest growing achievement gap is among rich kids and poor kids in America. And so yes, our high performing schools, our middle to above middle to high performing schools are doing as well as anyone. But we've got a lot of challenges with these other schools. And I think that the problem is, as Kai alluded to, is we haven't found a way to systemically make sure that we meet the challenges that face us in terms of educating our kids. But the other thing is internal. I think that if we talk about education reform, we talk about doing better, we've got to hug people while we change them. So we got to figure out the best way to win hearts and minds, because people don't know what they don't know. I mean, and so we got to lift up the models that work. I mean, you know, doing work in Louisiana, to see some of those women we work with in public housing who were able to get scholarships, get their kids in private schools, get their kids in charter schools. Several of them came to me who had dropped out and said, we didn't know education could be fun for our kids. And so when you excite the possibilities, then you elevate the whole notion of what education and learning can be. And I think that's where we need to be. And I also don't think that we need to be satisfied with incremental gains. I mean, I think that there's nothing wrong with us saying that 90 to 100% of our kids are either going to graduate or get some, you know, vocational education. And when we talk about, you know, 60, 50% in some cities, 60%, 70%, I don't think that's good enough.
Okay, there was a question all the way in the back. Yes.
Good afternoon. My name is Bishop
By the way,
Holloway.
this is the next to the last question. I have to do a little clock
Okay.
management.
My question is for the Chancellor, Ms. Henderson. I want to say outstanding job. Washington, D.C. schools have turned around. I'm a grandmother of children who go to Washington, D.C. schools. I'm a pastor, and also I run a drug ministry. I've seen the energy, the passion, and the challenge change in the last 3-4 years. And I am so proud of what you all are doing. My question is this. Educationally, I think you're on. What do we do emotionally? Because the emotional issues are greater than the educational issue. You can be an intelligent dummy, and that's what we're now pushing. People with brains, but no emotion, no heart, can't handle themselves. How can we do internal and external? And then how do we take that to the kids whose parents are disconnected? Can we get some programs into the school to help them grow with their children? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes, absolutely. So thank you for the compliment. We're working really hard. I think, you know, it is important for us to not just make sure that our young people are academically prepared, but to make sure that they can then take that and go out into the world and do something with it. And one of the things that we are thinking a lot differently about is how we create an educational system where children have to demonstrate knowledge in a very real world kind of way, so that they are being prepared for the world that they are going to go into. What do I mean by that? Nobody in their regular work life, except maybe me, sits in a room where like people just talk at you for 30 minutes, and then another person talks at you for 30 minutes, and then another person talks at you for 30 minutes, right? That's not what happens. In your regular life, there's a problem to solve. You have to work with groups of people to solve that problem. You've got to figure out how to get resources that you might have, some of which you might have, some of which you might not have. And at some point, there's some public demonstrable display of the resolution of that problem. Well, that's not how schools are set up, right? And so why do we give credit for how long you sit in a seat, not whether or not you've demonstrated mastery of the content and the way you actually are able to solve problems? You hear a lot of people talking about competency-based education. That's ultimately what that is. If children know a whole lot of stuff, but they aren't able to take that and translate it, then something is different. So for us, what that means is, in addition to a Common Core aligned curriculum, we are requiring that at every grade level and every subject area, there is what we call a Cornerstone Project, which is a project that every third grade teacher will teach across the city, which will also help us get to expectations, because there are different levels of expectations for different kinds of students. There's a rigorous project that everybody is going to do and then demonstrate their success at it. And it usually is not an individual pursuit, because so little of what we do is individual. It's also, it's often a group pursuit or what have you. And so changing the way teaching and learning happens in the classroom. On the parental front, I mean, we found two things. One, while I appreciate people's confidence in our ability to do everything, schools can't do everything. And so we have to figure out, but it's an opportunity to find partners who are experts in, you know, developing adult learners or helping families get the services that they need, and co-locating in the school or referring. And so we've begun to build partnerships both with city agencies and with nonprofits who can address the needs of our students at the same time that we're trying to address the academic needs. The other thing that we found, to be really frank about parents, is every single parent wants to help their kid, whether they are well off or not, whether they are well educated or not, whether they are tall, short, skinny, or fat. And it's our job to help them educate their kids. And so we've embarked upon a very interesting program where we actually have teachers give parents things to do with their kids at home, so parents don't have to guess. And when parents are part of helping their kid achieve, parents have a different level of self-efficacy. And in fact, they come to school more, and they take advantage of the kinds of programs that we now have located in the school. And then we see, you know, families change. We have adult education that we offer in many of our schools in the daytime and in the evening, so that parents can come to school with their kids. But in school districts that are struggling, it is a lot to ask us to get our core stuff right and get all of the ancillary stuff right. And so we need good partners to help us do that.
Thank you. I'm afraid the clock has run out on our panel. Please join me in thanking the members of the panel. Thank you. Good. Thank you.